Support comes from Mosby Building Arts, helping homeowners trade out old windows for modern, energy-efficient windows with curb appeal. Estimates at callmosby.com.
From St. Louis Public Radio. This is the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air. I'm Jason Rosenbaum. I just wrapped up another trip to Jefferson City during the final week of the Missouri General Assembly session. And to be honest, it was a bit jarring because it felt surprisingly normal. Unlike recent years, lawmakers did not take up deeply controversial proposals that provoked emotional speeches or last-minute procedural maneuvering. And with the exception of some brief turbulence, the Senate actually passed some major legislation tackling healthcare and public safety policy. In fact, the most dramatic thing I encountered all week was when a malfunctioning Senate microwave set off the fire alarm.
Fire has been reported in the building. Please proceed calmly to the nearest exit. Please do not use the elevators.
Now, if you've listened to this show for since January of this year, you probably remember how I reported on the generally low expectations about the 2026 legislative session. Lawmakers came to this conclusion because of how acrimonious things got in the Senate, where Republicans used the previous question RPQ motion to forcibly cut off debate on a ballot item to ban most abortions, a repeal of voter-approved paid sick leave, and a congressional redistricting plan aimed at ousting Democratic Congressman Emanuel Cleaver. Democratic Senate Minority Leader Doug Beck of Afton promised in May 2025 that things would be very rough throughout 2026.
Republicans have made up their mind what they're going to do here. They're going to destroy the Senate. That's what they're doing. They're going to destroy the Senate. So let's be clear. I am not a person that makes howled threats. I have never made howled threats in here. I've worked with every person in this chamber, but I will guarantee you nothing will happen. Nothing. The banner year that everybody had in this place, that is over with.
And to be clear, Senate Democrats absolutely followed through on what Beck said here. They brought proceedings to a halt at the beginning of session until Republicans agreed to make changes to the way senators can use the previous question motion. That motion has always been used fairly infrequently because the Senate has a long tradition of allowing unlimited debate. Republican Senator Curtis Gregory of Saline County said the rule change made sense.
You actually had to have 18 signatures to send the PQ forward, as opposed to, I think it was 10 signatures to send it forward, which that never made any sense in my mind anyways. Like, well, why do you need 10 signatures when you actually have to have 18 votes? So this just solidifies, like, hey, we're going to do this, and we've actually got the support to do it. So I saw no issue with it whatsoever.
Senator Brian Williams, a Democrat from St. Louis County, said the Republicans' decision to change how they cut off debate of Democrats was long overdue.
I think it was an opportunity for the Senate to do two things. One, admit that what happened last session was a complete failure of Missourians across the board. And the Republican Party, in my opinion, needed to look itself in the mirror and say, are we going to govern or are we going to uphold Donald Trump's agenda? And I believe our colleagues came together and recognized that we need to govern in Missouri and not prioritize some of the rhetoric that's happening at the federal level.
Still, just because the session was more productive did not mean that Republicans and Democrats agreed with everything that passed. The two sides still clashed over parts of the state's budget, which did not fully fund the state's K-12 foundation formula. And during the final week, lawmakers passed abortion-related legislation that critics argued addressed situations that are already illegal or don't happen. House Minority Leader Ashley Awney of Kansas City lambasted her GOP colleagues for pushing that legislation.
I'm sick of standing in this chamber, listening to my colleagues bare their souls and relive their sexual and pregnancy and infertility traumas to try to explain to the men in this room and the women who gleefully carry the water for the patriarchy in the name of Jesus, why women deserve access to life-saving health care.
And there was also Governor Mike Kehoe's top priority, a ballot measure that would allow lawmakers to expand Missouri's sales taxes to get rid of the income tax. Lawmakers authorized sending that to voters fairly early in the session, which Kehoe says presents Missourians with a pivotal choice.
This is a transformational moment for our state, and it's about more than just taxes. It's about growth. It's really about competitiveness, and it's about sending a message across the country that Missouri will compete and Missouri will win.
This year's election cycle will be the ultimate arbiter of whether Republicans succeeded in their last two legislative sessions. In addition to Kehoe's tax plan, Missourians will also decide on the aforementioned abortion ban, as well as a separate measure making it much harder to pass constitutional amendments. State Representative Ray Reed of Maplewood says it speaks volumes that Missouri Republicans have spent so much time on these types of issues.
You know, it's always amazing the wheels of government somehow can turn very quickly when they want to get their donors' priorities in place. But when it comes to actually doing things that have proven to help everyday working people, like paid family leave or increasing funding for public education, those things always kind of get kicked down the road.
After the U.S. Supreme Court decided to weaken the Voting Rights Act's protection of majority-minority districts, states like Louisiana, Tennessee, and Alabama rushed to dismantle heavily Democratic and heavily African-American districts in time for the 2026 elections. That court decision has fueled speculation that Republicans could, in 2027, try to dismantle Missouri's first congressional district in St. Louis and St. Louis County. That district has for decades been majority or plurality African American and elected black Democrats to Congress. It's a move that Republican Secretary of State Denny Hoskins fully supports.
U.S. Supreme Court has been definite that, hey, there's no more racial gerrymandering. In fact, in other states like, I believe, Louisiana, Alabama, and other states, they're making changes to make sure that there's no more racial gerrymandering and that they don't have majority-minority districts where literally districts, I mean, that's the definition of racism, is drawing districts based on the color of one's skin. We don't want that in Missouri.
Supporters of the current map argue the first district is not a racial gerrymander, but is instead partisan gerrymandering that consolidates Democrats into a compact St. Louis-based district. Republicans outside of St. Louis benefit from that, by the way, but it's an open question as to whether that argument persuades Missouri Republicans to leave the district alone. In any case, Democratic State Representative Marty Murray of St. Louis says both the black political community and black residents throughout the region need to be ready for an unprecedented fight.
I think they'll try. You know, I think the phone calls will come in to try to redistrict it. I mean, we've seen it happen state after state, so it wouldn't surprise me if it did. But if it does, then obviously we'll fight against it.
We need to take a quick break, but when we return, we'll break down more of the legislative session with STLPR's Sarah Kellogg and Lilley Halloran. This is the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air.
Support comes from Gemma, architects, planners, and designers seeking to bring joy to their clients and communities. Details at gemastl.com.
Welcome back to the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air. I'm Jason Rosenbaum. The 2026 Missouri General Assembly session is in the books, and while the final week of session perhaps didn't showcase epic rhetorical duels or major partisan showdowns, some of the bills headed to Governor Mike Kehoe's desk could have a major impact on Missourians' lives. Joining us now to analyze what passed and what did not pass this week is Sarah Kellogg, who covers all things state government and state politics for St. Louis Public Radio. Sarah, welcome back.
It's good to be back, Jason.
Also joining us is Lilley Halloran, St. Louis Public Radio State House reporting intern. Lilley, welcome to the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Sarah, why do you think the 2026 legislative session, against all odds, ended up being so productive?
I think it was because it was a lot of smaller bills. For the majority of what was done, they actually passed, from the numbers that we got from the Missouri House, 100 bills this year, which is a record. I think I haven't seen that many done. And I think a lot of it is because it was kind of ticky-tack things or smaller stuff that will affect Missourians' lives, but it's not, really flashy and kind of news breaking. And I think that because of that, there was more compromise and kind of a willingness to kind of see some of these issues done versus, some that was really, really partisan. So I think that and also I think a part of it is because they got a lot of the really big agenda items, the stuff that did cause more consternation, they got that done last year for the most part.
And Lilley, what were your overall impressions of the 2026 session?
Yeah, I would have to agree with Sarah. I would say a lot of the things that made it over were less contentious and sometimes incredibly bipartisan, like clearing legal barriers to divorce for pregnant women. But then there were also a lot of priorities that did not pass that Governor Kehoe had or the legislature had as a whole, such as property tax relief or establishing an A through F grading system for schools. So some of the things that were more contentious did not make it across the finish line.
If you have a question about what the Missouri legislature did or didn't do during their session, give us a call at 314-382-8255. That's 314-382-TALK. As I mentioned before, the turning point in the session appeared to be when senators agreed to make it harder to use what's known as the previous question, which forcibly cuts off Senate debate. Here's what Democratic Senator Stephen Weber of Columbia said about why his caucus came to the table.
I think all of us came in here as a group with a commitment to rebuilding the Senate. And I think the first thing we wanted to see this year before we really started having bills move was a commitment from the Republican Party that they also wanted to work collaboratively and avoid the mistakes of last year. And I think once that happened, once we put in the time, we put in the energy, we put in the work, that everybody held the floor for hours back in January. And I think once that happened and once that rule change was made, I think we felt more comfortable that they were committed to working collaboratively, which we always have been, and we were willing to do that.
That was Senator Stephen Weber of Columbia, a Democrat in the Missouri Senate. Sarah, what do you make of his comments about the new rules around the previous question, which, among other things, you have to have 18 senators instead of 10 to sign a previous question and forcibly cut off debate?
Yeah, for our listeners, that basically ends debate and forces a vote on a bill, which in the Senate is very much considered kind of a final option and not done as often. I do agree that it was the turning point. He mentions holding the floor for hours. Well, what they were doing was Democratic senators repeatedly this year, until this change was agreed upon, held up Governor Mike Kehoe's gubernatorial appointments and basically talked for hours until they kind of had to rescind and try again. And that did have a deadline. Like, if they didn't get that done within a certain amount of time, then those appointees would have not been able to be reappointed or appointed at all. And so there was kind of some leverage that Democrats were able to use to get this change. I also want to say, in addition to changing the PQ rules, they also required bills to remain kind of to sit on the calendar for a legislative day before they could bring it up, which I think Democrats say would slow things down and give people time to read things. So I think that was another concession that they were able to get. And I think they were able to do that through this maneuvering. And I think it did make for a less hectic Senate, and I think a more collaborative one.
I do wonder, though, how long this era of good feeling among senators will last. As Republican Senator Rick Bratton of Harrisonville explained to me, not everybody in the GOP caucus liked the restrictions on the PQ.
I think it's well for, I guess, getting the more mediocre type, less real transformative language done, I guess. Yeah, but I would have much rather have seen the rules stay the way they were prior, give us a little more leverage to get a little better Republican red meat issues done.
That was Republican State Senator Rick Bratton of Harrisonville. Sarah, do you see this Senate harmony lasting long term?
As far as I was able to monitor this year, Senator Bratton was one of the very few Republicans on the Senate floor who vocally complained about this. He even went so far to try and kill some Democratic-led consent bills, which one was honoring a firefighter who had passed away, before he eventually let them through. So I think there definitely is some complaints about that. But honestly, Republicans have a supermajority in the Senate and the House. If they have to, they can get bills done if they want to. And I guess as far as next year, it kind of depends on who's in charge. We'll have elections and new leadership, and and that could go either way. So we could see, maybe more of a Senator Gregory type leadership going, or, more of the way of the Freedom Caucus. So I guess time's going to tell on that one.
Before we get to some of the things that did pass, I do want to touch on some of the priorities that floundered. Lilley, lawmakers did not end up passing anything to legalize and regulate video lottery terminals. What ended up happening there?
Right, so these machines are often called VLTs. They're found in gas stations, bars, and fraternal organizations across the state. And this legislation would have allowed taxes on operators and given the State Lottery Commission responsibility for licensing and controlling the machines. It narrowly passed the House in February, but there was kind of a consensus that it was not going to make it through the Senate. That's because the President pro tem, Cindy O'Loughlin, has long been concerned about the legislation. She and many others think that those machines should not exist in the state at all. In February, a federal judge ruled they're illegal gambling devices, and the Attorney General, Catherine Hanaway, has begun to shut them down across the state, and some operators are unplugging them. So it looks like the future of the machines is kind of uncertain, but there's not a lot of opportunity for them to be legalized in the legislature as long as Cindy O'Loughlin is in charge.
And you mentioned this a little bit, Lilley, but we were expecting some major education policy in the last week of session that included potentially grading schools on an A through F scale, but that ran into some major opposition and did not end up getting passed. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so that did make it through the House, but not without a lot of debate and concern from Democrats in the House. The vote was entirely along party lines, pretty much. Democrats are concerned that establishing an A through F grading system for schools is going to unfairly set apart schools. There was part in this bill that would allow schools with better grades to get more funding. And so schools were concerned, teachers were concerned that this could possibly destabilize staffing and incentivize teachers from going to schools that have a bad grade, and it would ultimately create a greater divide. So it did make it through the House, but it did not make it through the Senate because there was a lot of that concern from Democrats.
Sarah, perhaps the most surprising thing that did not pass in the final week was this property tax legislative package. It includes something called siloing. Since you are St. Louis Public Radio's resident tax expert, what is siloing? And were you surprised by the failure of the legislature to deal with this issue?
I think I would have called you a liar if you'd have told me last year that this would be something I'd know a lot about, but it was, in theory, a priority this year. So siloing could also be called kind of the individual assessment of different property tax subclasses. And currently, those subclasses, which include, residential and commercial properties, they're all grouped together. And due to the Hancock Amendment, property tax rates must be lowered if property tax values rise higher than inflation. But when you group those subclasses together, that means one subclass will ultimately pay more in taxes if it rises in value faster than the others. So if you basically silo these subclasses so that the increased in the assessed value of one property type do not affect the others, it means that more taxpayers would likely to benefit from lower tax rates. Now, St. Louis County actually already silos its subclasses, and this legislation, if it had passed, would have required the rest of the state to do the same.
Now, there was some bitter recriminations between the Senate and the House on this issue. Here's Republican State Representative Tim Taylor speaking on the floor when he announced, or after he announced, that the property tax package was dead.
If you go out campaigning this summer and you stand in front of your constituents and you say, I really feel sorry for you, but you come in this building and you say, sorry, I can't vote against my schools. By God, they need everything they can get. Then you're not taking into account the taxpayer, and you're riding on their back, and you're leaving the holes in Hancock, and you're making them suffer so that you can sit there and not suffer at all.
That was Republican Representative Tim Taylor, who hails from Cooper County. Sarah, Democratic senators say the House kept moving the goalpost on what they wanted, and those senators also did not want to pass something that decimated local governmental services. So Can the two sides eventually come to an accord maybe next year on property taxes, given that the Senate doesn't really want to do anything radically destructive to local governmental entities?
Well, I mean, we'll see. I just want to say I was very surprised that they weren't able to get anything done on property taxes. Senate Republicans stood in front of the press at the beginning of session and said that it was their number one priority. And ultimately, nothing huge got done. Both Democrats and Republicans, acknowledged that their constituents are begging for something on this. So I was just honestly very surprised that nothing got done. And I have a feeling that we're going to talk about this probably next year. And like the year, I do think it's going to come up again next year. We'll see. And I have a feeling we're going to talk about this in a second. But, I think a lot of the effort this year went into passing the resolution that, if passed, would create a path for lawmakers to eliminate the state income tax by supplementing those lost dollars with sales and use taxes. I don't know if there was desire to do another tax thing, next year. So we'll see. I think property taxes are definitely going to come back next year.
You mentioned the next thing we were going to talk about, Sarah. You are an excellent seguer as usual, and that is the ballot item that would allow the legislature to expand the state's sales and use taxes as a means to get rid of the income tax. I think the biggest surprise about this, Sarah, is that it passed pretty early in session and was not a last week of session item. Was that also surprising to you?
I think initially, yes, but kind of thinking back on it, it kind of makes sense because ultimately I think that, since this was something that still has to go to voters and voter approval, I think there was less of like, oh, we have to stop this. We're the only, part for Democrats, we're the only ones standing between the way of this going to law. There is a lot of, Missouri voter input that has to now go into this passing, which is it being, passed through an election. So I just think that I think that's why it ultimately got through earlier than maybe people thought it would.
Given that context, I asked Governor Kehoe about whether the session would be considered a success if voters end up rejecting his tax plan. Here's what he said on Thursday.
First of all, I believe it will be successful. I want to say that. I think Missourians generally will agree to wanting to be able to keep more of their money. But as you know, and I said in the very beginning, we campaigned on this. We looked Missourians in the eye and said, we believe this is a good thing for our state, makes us competitive, lets you keep more of your own money, and we believe we should have put a plan. We did put a plan forward that's responsible and forward that for Missourians to decide on.
That was Missouri Governor Mike Kehoe speaking to reporters last week at the Missouri Capitol. So, Sarah, what would actually happen if this tax plan passes at the ballot box later this year?
I mean, boy, that's the question, isn't it? So, Democrats in the Senate were able to remove from this proposed amendment a portion of it that would have automatically eliminated the income tax. So now it can only be done by lawmakers passing statute, and they're going to have to figure out how to make up for the roughly $9 billion in revenue that the income tax generates in Missouri, whether that's through, sales and use taxes. And I think that there isn't a plan yet because, as Republicans have said, this is a problem for future legislators, and, if it does pass. So I think that's the question that we're going to see if it passes this year. That's the question that is going to have to be answered next year because right now there's not really one.
Democrats contend that this plan is another example of Republicans helping rich people at the expense of working and middle-class Missourians. Here's Senate Minority Leader Doug Beck of Afton talking about that rhetorical argument on Friday.
And we call it the everything tax because that's what it is. This is not about income tax. The only thing that the people are going to be voting for is to give the power back to politicians to be able to raise sales taxes on everything and use taxes on things that they've never paid before. Could also sales tax on gas and increase the cost of their life. So if that, however, somehow passes, I think it'd be very interesting to see what happens in this building.
That was Senate Minority Leader Doug Beck, a Democrat from Afton. Sarah, we obviously have to see how this campaign plays out, but do you see those types of arguments from opponents of this plan being effective?
I do. One of the organizations that has repeatedly spoken against this amendment when it was going through the building is AARP Missouri. And, and they've essentially said that they see this as nothing but a massive increase on taxes on older people, on retired people who don't pay an income tax but do pay sales taxes. So if you're getting rid of something that they don't even pay, older folks, retired folks aren't going to care about that as much. They're going to see that increase of sales and use taxes if that is what they go through. So I think that it is a pretty effective counterpoint. And I guess we'll see how it plays out.
During the last week of session, lawmakers finished work on these large omnibus bills around broad topics like public safety and healthcare. Lilley, you covered the healthcare bill that has some major changes in it. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, this bill was about 200 pages long. It's one of those Christmas tree bills. I didn't know what that was before I was in the Capitol for the first time, but a lot of lawmakers had their hand in this legislation, and it affects a lot of people in Missouri. Some of the major things, it will allow 12-month prescriptions for oral contraceptives, birth control pills at a time, which they say will make it easier for people to get that prescription and take it consistently. It also adds doula services to Medicaid coverage and expands telemedicine to people can establish their care online instead of a physical examination for a lot more cases now. It requires a lot of things of insurance companies, including you can't cap payment for anesthesia halfway through a surgery, and also requires tracking for alpha-gal and Lyme disease. So it touches a lot of aspects of healthcare, but it was really popular.
By the way, a Christmas tree bill is when you take a underlying bill and you put lots of amendments on it, similar to hanging ornaments on a Christmas tree. Thank you, Lilley, for using that terminology and letting me spread the holiday spirit in the middle of May. On another note, Missouri voters will be deciding whether sheriffs will remain elected positions, are basically establishing the status quo that they remain elected positions. Lilley, there was a lot of back and forth about whether there'd be a provision in this ballot item asking if the St. Louis sheriff should be an appointed position. What ended up happening here?
Right. So St. Louis ended up being taken out of this legislation. So we're sticking with the status quo in St. Louis. The sheriff is already an elected position, but it is included from the ballot measure. There was a lot of back and forth on this. The city was added in an amendment by Senator Carla May of St. Louis, and then it was taken out in the House and then put back in and taken out again. What it will do is ask the voters to decide if sheriff should be an elected position, and they'll enshrine that in the Constitution if voters say yes, but St. Louis is excluded from that. And it comes as there's been a lot of debate over who should be able to choose the next sheriff for the St. Louis role after the former sheriff, Alfred Montgomery, was ousted in December.
And Lilley, just to put a finer point on it, if this ends up passing, the legislature could still pass a bill making the St. Louis Sheriff's Department an appointed position. Is that basically what this would do?
No, this bill will keep it the same, but they could choose to make it an appointed position, and that there was a bill to do that, but it died in a Senate committee this year.
Yes, in the future, like in 2027, 2028. So let's peer into the future. There's a lot of speculation that lawmakers may try and dismantle Missouri's 1st congressional district, a majority-minority seat that takes in St. Louis and St. Louis County. But interestingly, State Representative Steve Butts of St. Louis does not think lawmakers will actually follow through with it.
I think this whole redistricting push is not wanted by anybody except Trump, and it's his last-ditch effort to try to not lose the House that he's going to lose anyway. I think his gas prices and the war in Iran have sealed that fate.
That was State Representative Steve Butts, a Democrat from St. Louis. Sarah, a lot of Democrats were telling me they were very nervous that Butts may be wrong and Republicans will follow through on a contentious congressional redistricting push next year. What's your read of the situation?
You know, this is anyone's guess. I think we will be in a very different spot politically than we are right now. You know, we'll be in the final at this point next year. If we're talking next year legislative session, which please God, give me some time off. But, you know, we'll be in the final 2 years of a Trump presidency. And that might be one, like Butts said, where he may not have a trifecta anymore. And normally those last 2 years of a presidency, you know, there's not as much leverage coming from the president, you know, and I think that that could change the minds of whether or not something has to be done because President Trump wants it to, which was basically what happened last year with the legislature, with the Missouri legislature redistricting out Representative Cleaver's district. So I think that politically we might be in a very different spot, which might lead to a lack of enthusiasm. And also, you know, we've talked about this before, that with Mo 1, you know, that kind of it benefits Mo 2 and 3 and keeps mainly Democrats into Mo 1. And so I think that if you try to draw out Mo 1, that could be some problems for, you know, Representative Wagner, et cetera, et cetera. So I guess we'll just really have to wait and see. That's a really good question that I just feel like we just won't know the answer until until there's a bill filed or not.
Believe it or not, Sarah, some of my sources who draw hypothetical congressional maps for fun have drawn a hypothetical congressional map that basically splits St. Louis and St. Louis County into 5 different congressional districts. It's currently St. Louis County is in 2, St. Louis City is in 1 right now. And basically, you would have basically 8 Republican-leaning seats based off the election data from 2024 and 2022. But if the margins that Trump had in the rural areas go down significantly, you may have like a 5-3 Democratic map or even like a 4-4 Democratic map. So that's sort of the risk you were talking about. And that you probably
absolutely. I think there's, the people still, you can only draw so far for advantages. And if it becomes a wave election or something that's just above what you're thinking of, that could lead to it not going the way you want. So I do think it's a risk that Republicans will have to see whether or not they want to take.
And Sarah, in addition to the tax plan, voters will also decide on legislative directed ballot items to ban most abortions and make it harder to amend the Constitution through the initiative petition process. They'll also possibly decide on whether to accept or reject the state's 2025 congressional map. If Missourians vote down all of these things, would it be a condemnation of what the legislature did over the past 2 years?
Yes, I think that if Missourians vote these measures down, we also have to say there might be a possibility of reintroducing sick leave resolution because that was overturned by lawmakers last year. I think that sends a pretty strong message that Missourians do not want these initiatives passed. But, we'll probably also see some people maybe vote down these resolutions or these proposed amendments and then vote for Republicans who put them on the ballot. So I think we'll see if anything truly changes in like the attitudes, response of how these are taken. But, I feel like I've been witnessing that dynamic for the entirety of my tenure here of voting down these initiatives, yet voting for the people that put them on the ballot. So I guess we'll kind of see.
Right. And I think it is just important for our listeners to know is there is basically no scenario where the Republicans do not retain control of the House and Senate next year. There are definitely scenarios where they don't have supermajorities in either chambers. It's more likely that the Republicans will lose the supermajorities in the House. The Senate is a bit more of a long shot because there really are seen as 2 seats that the Democrats could get, with a third in Buchanan and Platte County that's seen as more of a long shot. So I guess we'll have to see what happens there, Sarah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's only 3 seats in the House, and then the 2 seats in the Senate that we've talked about. And I know Senator Beck last year felt very, very confident of flipping the seat in Springfield, and then we'll have to see with the Lee Summit seat. But it's not an impossibility. But you are correct; the Republicans will still contain control, but the likelihood of supermajorities isn't looking as good as it's been in prior years.
Sarah Kellogg is STLPR State House and Politics reporter. Sarah, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
And Lilley Halloran is STLPR's State House reporting intern. Lilley, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
This episode was produced by Jason Rosenbaum.
Our audio engineer is Aaron Dorr. This podcast was mixed and edited by Aaron.
Our executive producer is Alex Hoyer.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations. And leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thanks.
St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri St. Louis.
Hi, I'm Laura Hamden, and my colleague Jessica Rogan and I are your daily hosts of the Gateway newsletter. We meet with the editors in the STLPR newsroom every weekday to bring you the top local stories of the day in a quick and easy 6-minute read by 6 a.m. In an age of overwhelm, it's a refreshing, thoughtful take on the news day, if we do say so ourselves. Fine-tune your daily news habit with the Gateway newsletter. Subscribe at stlpr.org/gateway.